Welcome to another episode of The Deeper Pulse and the continuation of the Culture series. Before we dig into this week's content, I'd like to once again thank patrons of the pod whose monthly donations make this work possible and help to keep the main feed of this podcast ad-free. Bonus conversations continue to roll out over on Patreon in the ongoing Deconstructing Dogma bonus series, which is getting meatier by the moment as more and more of you are showing up to take this Culture series content even deeper. It's a space to gather and access all the extras for as little as $5 a month. Patreon memberships can be canceled at any time with 0 questions asked. Last week, I dropped the second half of a 2-part conversation with former org trainer Jill Pagano. In this latest bonus episode, she shares about the lost years she spent investing time and loads of money in a one-sided business model that never really panned out. Jill is infusing a lot of courage into this larger conversation, and she's been doing her own accountability and repair work publicly. And if you'd like to listen in, head over to patreon.com/The Deeper Pulse. Alrighty, onward. Please be advised, today's episode contains reference to cultic abuse, systemic inequities, and racial trauma. Listen with care. It's really great to be back on the main feed with you, and I would love to say that I've returned to the mic well rested, but the truth is, things have been pretty busy behind the scenes as I've been playing catch up on production and fielding growing correspondence with listeners. I do my very best to respond thoughtfully to each message because I care, and also because I know what it feels like when this work hits you smack dab in the face out of nowhere. I've been there. Let's not forget that I'm pretty new to all of this too. In fact, everything I've shared over the past year or so has been me learning in real time, with you as my witness, paying forward knowledge borrowed from others. So yeah, it wasn't all that long ago that I was simply reeling around all of this cult recovery content. So I'd like to offer a gentle reminder, especially for anyone who is somewhat new to deconstructing wellness culture indoctrination. The topics covered in these episodes can be activating. Binging this content may not be the best idea. It's important to remember that our mental health matters most, and that when we are dysregulated, we're not even fully receiving the information we hear. If while listening to the Deeper Pulse content, you begin to feel emotionally overwhelmed, or if you catch yourself spinning out in regards to what's being said, please take care and step away. Take a literal breather and a timeout. And should those feelings persist, please consider seeking the support of a mental health professional. There's no shame in asking for help. In fact, shame tends to cling to us most when we don't. Therapy has been a personal godsend for me, and it's really thanks to the therapeutic work that I've done over many, many years that I'm even able to have these conversations week after week in real time. And really, in full transparency, I'm saying all of this right now due to the recent surge in listenership and the fact that the demand for support is beginning to exceed my capacity. Okay, PSA over. Thanks for hearing me on all that. Today, we are shifting our attention away from the org and the go-to topic of wellness culture in general, because I want to take some time to zoom out, way out. For a long time now, I've been longing to shine a light on where I suspect all of this culty business first originated. I mean, why is culty culture so damn prevalent? Human nature, to be sure, but that's just the lazy answer. What about intergenerational systems of influence that have been shaping the collective cult psyche and our ongoing behavior for centuries? Small group cult dynamics are really in many ways microcosmic reflections of more systemic cultural biases. In the mainstream, cultiness very often shows up through internalized prejudices, racism, sexism, ableism, isms of all sorts that have been passed down for generations through supremacist cult community credo. While we've certainly had our high points, human history is, by and large, a collection of traumas, many of which, sadly, our history books whitewash and or don't even dare speak of. Trauma and shame without a voice poisons connection. And so it's really no wonder that as a human culture, we continually repeat the same old patterns of oppression, just dressed up in modern garb. One of the ways we do this is through both conscious and unconscious reinforcement of social hierarchies. This higher up, lower than cult mindset is ubiquitous in modern culture, and social media clicks aren't helping. In this day and age, leaders and influencers can buy into a system that leverages visibility to mobilize and radicalize more people than ever. It's a modern, souped-up version of cult creation, but it's the same formula. Manipulate love bomb loyalty, weaponize value-driven beliefs, and then use them to justify the dehumanization of others. This sort of culty BS has been going on for centuries. And I would argue that it was cult dynamics that fueled the colonial mindset, that explain why the land that I live on was stolen via cultural genocide and the attempted erasure of indigenous populations, which has since evolved into a more invisible violence occurring systemically in my backyard and globally. And there are many other examples. Legislation removing a human's right to their own bodily autonomy, racial profiling, and the militarization of law enforcement, widening divisions between red states and blue states in the ununited States of America, tone policing of progressive social activism, and the ongoing destruction of planet Earth. The list goes on and on and on. And I'm not trying to be a downer here, I'm simply naming the facts, that when it comes to collective cult recovery, the stakes are really fucking high. And as we've seen repeatedly, regardless of the role we play, leader, follower, inner circle enabler, the storyline is very often the same. So I guess I'm suggesting that the small c cult experiences that we've been exploring throughout this series, that they might just be behavioral reenactments of collective colonial trauma. Similar to how we can repeat patterns that we experienced within our families of origin in our subsequent romantic partnerships, so too do we cycle again and again back through our collective dysfunctions. Things like racism, sexism, ableism, classism, heterosexism, again, the list goes on and on. These socially constructed frameworks are culty because they quite literally dictate who has more power over whom, what, when, and for how long. And until we do the hard work of dismantling these oppressive ideologies, both internally and systemically, these biases will continue to operate reflexively in the background of all of our daily interactions. And in this way, we are, each one of us, reinforcing long-standing colonial power over dynamics. And when I say us, in this instance, I am very much speaking as a white woman. Race is going to be an important part of today's discussion, and it is a topic that may be triggering for some white-skinned folks who are listening. If that happens to be you, and remember, I'm in the feels with you here, if you're already feeling squeamish and lead-bellied around even the mention of this topic, I want to invite you to consider overriding any urge you might have to skip over this episode. Because today, my guest and I are speaking as white women, and we're speaking directly to you. And also, and again, I'm speaking through a cult recovery lens here, I want to remind you that your feelings are very much to be expected. Make no mistake, race is a culty social construct that, like it or not, we have been conditioned to buy into. And the impulse to back away when we're invited to look our indoctrination square in the eye, it's perfectly normal. Very much like the first time, and probably even the 11st time, someone said to me, "Hey Candice, I think that group that you're in is pretty damn culty." I was like, nuh-uh, no way. I took great offense even to the suggestion of such a thing, and rather than engaging in self-inquiry around it all, I pushed back hard, and then I dug my head deeper into the sand in denial. This is part of the process. Cognitive dissonance is real, y'all. It's the self-protective reflex that kicks in when our strongly held beliefs are challenged. And it often looks like an urge to bolt, rather than to turn and look at the internal tension that results when new and often more complex information is presented to us. Because the cult mindset is, by definition, very fixed. It doesn't much like being challenged. So when our blind spots are illuminated in new ways that run counter to our view of ourselves and our place in the world, it's pretty natural to feel some resistance. And I'm really hoping that acknowledgement of this fact is enough to encourage you to stick around, because this conversation connects to the very heart and soul of this series. I want to talk for a moment about social position. Social position, which is sometimes also referred to as social location, refers to our personal placement in a specific culture or social hierarchy. When we understand and name our social location, we are able to speak with great clarity about privilege and or our lack thereof. Privilege is, by definition, culty AF. It is defined as unearned access or advantage that has been granted to specific groups of people because of their membership in a social group. And it's important to note here that privilege isn't a woke culture soundbite or even a belief. It's a quantifiable measure of very real systemic inequity. See the show notes if you'd like a link to an article that features some of that data. The point is, proximity to privilege quite literally matters as it relates to gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic class, physical health, and body size, just to name a few. Obviously, or at least I hope it's pretty freaking obvious, there is nothing inherently better or worse when it comes to the granulation within each of these categories. But like it or not, and whether you choose to believe it or not, capital C cult hierarchies grant privilege to some more than others. The patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism. Many of us unconsciously shape our lives and our expressions around these culty cultural ideals, which were long ago defined by angry white men in power. And when we do so, whether we mean to or not, we reinforce systems of colonial oppression. And contrary to what's been written in self-help circles and New Age gospels, good intentions do not always lead to positive results. In fact, more often than not, this overemphasis on intention results in a sort of apathy when it comes to actual on-the-ground impact. And in many cases, and I'm speaking for myself here, we're just repeating the same culty bullshit, just all cloaked in love and light. For nearly 2 decades, and in the name of wellness and empowerment, I personally and professionally reinforced white women in wellness fitness ideals that center white supremacist metrics, appropriate Indigenous teachings, and inadvertently, and sometimes explicitly, body shame those who don't fit into a purity-obsessed, fat-phobic narrative of what thin white folks call, quote-unquote, health. That's a lot, right? And this is what I mean when I say that we're all in collective cult recovery. And that the more privilege and proximity to power that we possess, the more culty indoctrination we have internalized that we must untangle ourselves from. And understanding our social location helps us to determine to what degree we're benefiting from or are being disenfranchised by these capital C cult dynamics. In 1989, Columbia Law School professor Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, which essentially refers to how 2 or more social constructs intersect to shape our social location. So, for example, due to many intersecting systems of oppression, a Black trans woman, simply based on her God-given identity, is at an exponentially greater risk of harassment, discrimination, and violence than your average white cis woman living in suburban America. Both of these women might carry a can of mace in their purse, but one runs a statistically higher risk of attack. That's just a fact. And since I'm speaking as a white woman to a mostly white women in wellness audience, I want to just for a moment touch upon my own social location. I am a white, thin, middle-class, able-bodied, hetero-passing, cis woman who was born in the United States of America, where I have been able to leverage my social position to achieve status and upward class mobility. Acknowledgement of my unearned privilege does not in any way discount from all of the hard work I've done, nor does it suggest that my life has been without hardship. I suffered childhood abandonment, sexual abuse, and developmental trauma. I grew up in a low-income family with a raging alcoholic stepdad who was doing the best he could after serving 2 terms in the Vietnam War. I was the treasured daughter of a young mother who felt she had no choice but to stay put in a dysfunctional marriage. I ended up with a panic disorder at age 16, and complex PTSD was my diagnosis later in life. Life wasn't easy. And also, my life wasn't made even harder due to the color of my skin, the shape of my body, or an undiagnosed learning disability, for example. Some shit happened to me, yeah, but relatively speaking, I grew up with considerable privilege. There were a great many things I was able to take entirely for granted. Things like food, shelter, physical safety, positive loving attention, social acceptance, higher education, healthcare, mental health treatment, and when push came to shove, my looks, blonde hair, and blue eyes granted me the unearned benefit of the doubt. And that's the thing about privilege. It's when we have it that we're the most blind to it. When life is working for us and our people, we tend to not notice how others are faring. Or I guess it's more honest and accurate to say that we pretend not to notice, because naming and acknowledging systemic harm very often comes at a personal cost. And here's again where the invisible cult mechanics are at work. When it comes to cult hierarchies, anytime we advocate for those in a different social location than us, we compromise said position. And we're very often gaslit, shamed, and silenced. This is both a very big and a very small deal. And I'll tell you why. It's a big deal because belonging is so critical to a sense of grounding in this world. But the fear of being socially outcast for standing up for what we believe, that's a fear that is entirely surmountable. We can open our eyes to privilege, override internal resistance and social indoctrination, and develop the psychological capacity to take on the, relatively speaking, very minimal risk that we need to take on in order to stand up for those who are experiencing harm. Doing the right thing often comes at a cost, and it's a price worth paying, especially in this case, because saving face isn't anywhere near as important as saving lives. And we're talking about patterns of systemic oppression here, which quite literally means that people's lives are on the line. And so, truth be told, it's with more than a little trepidation that I'm stepping into conversations around these topics. But similar to when I first started my cult recovery journey, I feel more committed to the truth than to the cult-minded identities that have kept me silent around these topics for so long. And so I'm going to embrace the imperfection around everything I just said and lead us into this conversation with one more quick definition, which is around the topic of decolonization. Now, I want to say that my guest is going to speak to this, and she has far more expertise in this area than I do. But I want to make a quick attempt at defining this concept in ways that directly relate to the work that we've been doing throughout the Culture series. Colonialism isn't just something out of a history book. It's an ongoing global project, and I would argue a psychological headspace, wherein settlers continually occupy and or appropriate that which belongs to those they have socially positioned as less than. It is not at all hard to see that colonialism has a whole hell of a lot in common with cult leadership. Colonialism and high demand influence, they are both all-encompassing, ongoing projects of ideological supremacy where there is a power over flex, a consistent offloading of trauma, and hierarchical domination. Both are coercive and oppressive impositions that exploit and dehumanize, systematically robbing people of agency and resources. And so, to decolonize, at least as I am speaking of it here in this series, I see it as multifaceted. First and foremost, it is about centering those who are or have been exploited and marginalized. It's about stepping back, listening, and spotlighting diverse perspectives. And yet, the more I learn from anti-racism educators, the more I've come to believe that this decolonization process must begin within. Which brings me to the second piece, which is a lead-in to the purpose of this whole two-part conversation. And my guest this week is doing important work that's really helping me to understand all of this a bit better. Decolonization is also about critical self-examination and looking at how, as a descendant of white colonial settlers, I have inherited the trauma of their colonial displacement, and also they have passed down to me the responsibility and the hard work of relational accountability. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, Resmaa Menakem writes, "White Americans can create culture that confronts and dismantles white body supremacy. Any suggestion that they are unable to rise to this challenge is a lie. White Americans are anything but helpless or fragile. They are, of course, precisely as capable as any other human beings, but they need to refuse to dodge the responsibility of confronting white body supremacy or the responsibility of growing up." Yes, growing up. It's true, we don't choose the culture that we're born into, but I would argue that it is our responsibility to heal it. And this week's guest is here to help us figure out how we might go about taking on such a daunting task. Aleyah-Erin Lennon identifies as a diasporic Irish descendant and white settler Canadian who has lived her entire life in Anishinaabeg territories. She is an artist, activist, and scholar who has spent the last 15 years working for and learning from Indigenous communities across the Great Lakes region in service to their ecological and educational visions. Aleyah's graduate work involves ongoing partnership with Indigenous elders, knowledge holders, and co-conspirators with whom she has been learning from and working with in community. Through an anti-colonial and trauma-informed lens, Aleyah practices what she describes as living activism. Her goal? To strategically understand her roles and responsibilities in healing disconnection and abuses in the trilogy of our relationships to self, others, and land. Navigating the complexities of decolonizing identity work and intergenerational trauma recovery, Aleyah, like many white women in wellness spaces, has long been searching for a sense of identity and belonging, and for spiritual community. Her work weaves poetry, story sharing, and diverse cultural narratives into a landscape of questions concerning our sense of identity and belonging. She is here today to share openly about her personal experiences in wellness spaces and her years working for Indigenous communities, which has afforded her a unique and informed perspective as a white woman growing into embodied understanding around relational accountability and healing. In this episode and the next, Aleyah and I will use language inspired by the hard work of Indigenous, Black, and Brown teachers and activists who have, once again, done the grueling labor for us white folks. In this instance, by providing us with context, language, and intellectual frameworks that make conversations like these possible. As we've touched upon in earlier episodes, BIPOC folks are very often tokenized in DEI circles and in white-led spaces such as these. They're expected to lead conversations on these topics, to help us deconstruct the racism that our ancestors invented and inflicted upon their people. And I've heard many anti-racism educators reflect back an understandable resentment that this has become yet another privilege that we white folks expect to be afforded. And you may have noticed a lack of diversity in the podcast lineup. Some of this is due to the segregation that exists in the white wellness spaces that I've long occupied. And part of it is also that I'm very reluctant to tokenize and potentially re-traumatize a person of color by inviting them on to talk about these topics. I really don't think it's much of a stretch to say that it's a little bit like asking a traumatized person to sit in therapy alongside their abuser, which is again a scenario that is very familiar to those of us who have been involved in so-called accountability in culty circles. So I guess I wanted to name that out loud for those of you who might be wondering why two white women are sitting down to talk about these things. And I want to say to any BIPOC listeners that are out there, I'd love to hear from you if it serves you to reach out. And also, I want to say on behalf of both Aleyah and myself, as two white women, we are not here to deliver a lesson on anti-racism. This is us having a public-facing conversation, exposing our own process, and shedding light on the messy imperfection that is inherent in this work. Aleyah and I come together today with the shared belief that we each must take it upon ourselves to do the personal work required to dismantle colonial consciousness in real time. And specifically in this context, when it comes to wellness cult supremacy and rampant issues around cultural appropriation, which we'll move into in the second half of this convo. Since I'm so new to conversations around these topics, I'm coming into it with as much of a beginner mind as possible, leaning heavily into Aleyah's academic fieldwork and ongoing collaboration with Indigenous elders, who have, by the way, offered their blessing for us to share this two-part conversation with you here today. We appreciate your grace as we learn and unlearn out loud together around these understandably sensitive topics. Here's part one of my conversation with Aleyah-Erin Lennon. Is that a painting or a picture behind you?
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. I'll move my camera around. This is a photo my friend Natalie took. She's an amazing filmmaker and photographer. And that is what I call a great grandmother cedar from the west coast of Turtle Island. I think a human would be like as big as my finger next to her. Like she's just like so old and massive and amazing. And it's a source of deep, calm, and soothing energy for me.
That's so great. Well, thank you for being here with me today. How are you feeling going into this conversation?
I'm excited and a little bit nervous, but I've done my kind of embodied self-care and I've prayed. That's a bit of a trigger word. What I mean when I say that is kind of just centered and clarified my intention and called upon my well ancestors to kind of just have the intention to, first of all, enjoy this.
Yes.
And to speak honestly and clearly about what needs to be said.
And we're in this together. I mean, all we can do is the best we can do in this moment, expressing around things that for a very long time haven't been talked about. So, of course,
by us, maybe.
By
us,
white folks. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right. Which is really part of the point of why we're here. So before we dive into all of that, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. So I guess I'll preface it with saying that my introduction may be a little different than what some of your listeners may have heard, but it's in the tradition of how I've been taught by the people in whose lands I live. So Ani Bojo, Aleyah-Erin Lennon, Indigenous, Jaganashi Koyandal, Ireland and Dunjabal, Omame wa Niniwag Indal, Chimikwich Kirigan Zibi. So that's a little bit about me, where I am and where I come from in Anishinaabeg, the language of the Ojibwe people. And I'd also really love, because this is a big part of my journey and what I'm a bit about here to talk about, is to use my ancestral language of Irish Gaelic to say a few words of welcome.
Please.
Diadich, Ishta Wuna Mahering me, Hik Mohinshir Goal and Talanifa, Agas Goro Oramas ad Hortstom Shil Erfad, Tame Mahone Ikriak Kirigan Zibi. So basically, acknowledging the land, her people, and my relational responsibilities, and telling your listeners a little bit about where I'm coming from. I live in Kirigan Zibi, which is the territory of the Algonquin Nation, the Omame Maniniwag, and I acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest. So it is upon me to know, respect, embody the responsibilities of my treaty relationships. I want to shout out and honor the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg nations in whose lands I've lived my entire life. This land is not my own, and yet it is the only home I've ever known. My ancestors came from Ireland 2 and 4 generations ago. They were fleeing genocide, colonial abuse, and enforced poverty only to become complicit in the same violence here.
Mm.
So today I'm choosing a different way of relating here, one that draws on the teachings of the first peoples here, as well as the gifts of my own Celtic ancestors. I'm committed to dismantling systems of oppression, to listening, learning, and taking accountable action towards building relationships of respect, peace, and friendship within the places I call home.
Mm-hmm.
So, Miigwech, thank you for letting me share those words.
Yes, thank you for sharing them. It's so beautiful, and I just feel really moved by the sense of integrity I feel that you come into this conversation with. And it's a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a while, and also am just so very much in the process of learning and unlearning. And so as I'm
Me too.
taking in, yeah, right?
Me
Are
too.
we? Right,
Yeah.
we are. And just being in, just even in the presence of that much, just your introduction and noticing all that comes up within my body, the moments when I dissociate, all the things. I just want to thank you for laying the foundation by bringing just so much forward from the very beginning, which is, the integrity we're after. And I just want to name that I have had that experience as I'm hearing you, and I'm just naming it in case some of the listeners have that experience too. And do you have any thoughts around even just that? Because I see you responding to that comment. Say more
Yeah.
about how that lands for you.
Well, I'm just so grateful for you. And I love how evident your heart-centeredness and the work that you're doing comes across. I feel so safe in your hands
So
on this podcast. And you remind me of the first time I heard a white woman introduce herself in an Indigenous language. And when I first heard somebody speak Irish, it was very impactful. It was a real kind of whoa. And I had tears. It was just really powerful. And I can also say, you might be able to hear it in my voice, I get filled with, I mean, it could be nervousness, but it's a power. It's something deeply vulnerable and shaky. And I think it's powerful. What I've learned mostly from the Anishinaabeg or the Indigenous women who have supported me on my learning journey in a big way is culture lives in language. And that's why colonial forces the world over have, that's one of their tools, is to ban language. And the words we use, the language we speak, completely shapes our ability to perceive the world around us and to relate to it, even in the grammatical structure of our languages, let alone even just the words in English that we choose.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something I try to embody and bring forth, because these languages, Indigenous languages in North America, Turtle Island, Canada, US, however you want to term them, are endangered, and they need to be supported to resurge and thrive.
Mm-hmm.
But then on another hand, it's like respecting the protocols of the place I live, right? Hi, my name is, these are my people, this is where I come from, this is how I got here, and it's a little bit about me, so you know more about me. That's something I've learned directly from Anishinaabeg people.
Mm-hmm. So just for folks who haven't been exposed to your work, and we're of course going to link to your website and all the wonderful writing that you've done. Tell us who you are, what you do, and what you love, where your passions lie.
Well, I'm a 40-year-old woman. I identify as a second generation diasporic Irish descendant and white settler Canadian. I live in Canada. I have a day job. Currently, I work as a senior policy advisor in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and health and wellness space. And I'm only remotely qualified to be doing that kind of work because of the last 10 to 15 years of working for and learning from Indigenous elders and communities, whether it is activism work, solidarity work, walking for the water with Nibiamo Sadamajig and the Sacred Water Circle, or community voices for Minoman in Mishisagi territory, and alongside that, far too many years in academia, dedicating myself to really learning this stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
my master's was in sustainability studies, but really my home was the Chani Wenjack School of Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Environmental Science. I'm really indebted to the staff and students there and that whole community for a lot of the transformative learning I've been able to do, which for me is what I conceive of as like my embodied spiritual practice. I also, I'm a survivor of trauma. We have intergenerational trauma in my Irish line, quite a lot of complex stuff, mental illness, suicide, alcoholism, you name it, we got it. Mm-hmm. And so I've been on a journey to kind of save myself in a lot of ways. And that's a very, very key piece of, I think, who I am and what my days consist of. And I'm also an artist. I sing, I write poetry, and I am currently collaborating with a number of the folks I've just mentioned to turn a lot of the journey I've been on into a book for wider audiences. So that takes up a fair bit of time and energy as well.
It's so exciting, though.
I'd also say one of the most important things about me is I'm a tree hugger and an absolute, like a legitimate tree. You will find I'm that woman.
Yeah. I've been known to do some hugging of trees myself.
Yeah, at any given moment you can see me kind of wandering around talking to bees and singing to the water.
That's so great.
So yeah, full disclosure.
So tell us how well, first of all, is there anything going back and looking at your life and who you are, maybe even your upbringing and how it shaped you as a person, that led you into having an interest in this and longing to study and learn from all the wonderful mentors that you're influenced by?
That's a really beautiful question. Thank you. My brain kind of goes through like a Rolodex swirl of images and memories. In no particular order, I would throw out. I used to earn some of like my living by being an adventure nature guide, like taking groups of folks into the backcountry of Algonquin Park, for example, and kind of keeping them safe and just kind of facilitating their getting to know the land. And I remember on a portage, which means just like walking from one body of water to the other, and everybody was loving it. And it was a beautiful day and a beautiful space. And I remember kind of having this, like an echo or a memory or a feeling, just a slight twist to the left, where even though we were surrounded by trees in a protected area, I knew that these were new trees, and the old growth trees, like the one you see behind me, had all been clear cut and the land had been shaved bare, a few generations ago for logging and such. And the grief, like the real fall to your knees and weep grief of that loss, haunts me. I've since learned a lot about my ancestral, tradition of the keening women and the grief carriers and how profound that work is, but don't need to really get into that. But I've always longed for a deeper connection, and I've always had some kind of sense that something's not well here. So I think that's the most honest and direct answer. A more woo slant on it could be that some part of me somewhere said yes to ancestral work, to accountability work. And there are ancestors of this place and there are ancestors of the place my people came from. And they speak through those mentors and they speak through my dreams and poetry. I call them liminal points on my journey, like, transformational education. I have these liminal spaces or points of possibility that change the course of your direction in life. And one of those was in 2008. I was invited by a Haudenosaunee man by the name of Danny Beaton to the Circle of All Nations in Maniwaki, Quebec, on the land of Algonquin elder grandfather Commanda Ba. Ba is a grammatical addition you put on the end of somebody's name when they've passed over, when they're no longer earthside. grandfather, William Kamanda Ba, was an incredible person, and he had a vision, and he called it the Circle of All Nations. And it was what I experienced when I went there was like 4 days, tent city, sunrise ceremonies with elders from all over the world. There was abuelas from the Hopi Nation, and there was, elders from Eastern European nations. And it was a time to learn and listen. And I was invited to, for example, help the abuela within the community there to build a sweat lodge and to experience that profound ceremony and cook in the outdoor kitchens and learn the teachings as we made bannock. And I think one of the most profound parts was just being invited into the giveaway blanket. It was just so lovely. There was so much kindness, and coming from a pretty chaotic, displaced background personally, it felt weird. It felt like, whoa, this is a very different way of being treated and being welcomed. And when I was driving home, it was around the time that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada was going around and hearing the stories and the truth of survivors of the residential school system, which is essentially genocide. Mm-hmm. And I just remember pulling over and sobbing, just being overcome with grief. And I had found a piece. I had found a piece of this vague, haunting sense that something wasn't well. I had been exposed to what we as, I guess, white people, or at least me as a white person growing up in suburbia, had never been exposed to. The Indigenous people in whose lands I was living. I think there's like a sense of erasure, like they used to exist, and they certainly still do. They exist. Mm-hmm. And the grief was an anger, like outrage. It was outrage about what we have lost and what we are a part of, like the harm and how damaging it is for not only these wonderful people I had just met, but for the world and me personally. Yeah, so I got something there that I didn't even fully understand I was starving for. So I think that was the moment where I kind of like wiped my tears away, and I was like, okay, I'm going to figure some of this shit out. Mm-hmm. I have a direction now. I'm going to go do some learning. Yeah. And see how I can maybe dedicate my cunning to the cause.
And you've been doing that pretty much since. And when we spoke in preparation for this conversation, one of the things you really wanted to emphasize was really that even so, that doesn't make you an expert on any of this. And
yeah, so I just want to say, like, even though maybe by Western standards, I've got some advanced degrees and I've been doing stuff for a while, I really am not an expert. I'm deeply uncomfortable with that term. And I also want to say that, like, everything I can speak about, decolonial pedagogy, anti-racist work, like all of that stuff I have learned from BIPOC folks, from Indigenous elders, from Black writers. And I don't want to, paraphrase and package, and you shouldn't get that information from me. I think what I'm trying to offer is my story and what it has felt like and been like to embark on this journey of, I guess, decolonizing identity work and deep critical spiritual work. So yeah, I guess with my research and writing, I have described it as kind of just mapping the landscape, kind of dumping out all the puzzle pieces and flipping them all over and being like, okay, this is like the basket of shit and beautiful treasures that we have to sort ourselves through and locate ourselves within.
Yeah.
That's what I've been kind of busy doing for the last number of years. I don't claim to have many answers. Actually, one of the biggest parts of this work is to embrace uncertainty and messiness and it is emotional. So it's just kind of a landscape of questions.
Yeah. Well, I really, really appreciate you saying that it's important for us to all be reminded of our role in this. And also for folks who are listening and they're like, what does this whole conversation about decolonization and anti-racism, what does this have to do with cult dynamics? And I know that you and I, part of why we talked for 2 hours is because we have lots of thoughts on that.
An awesome question.
It is such a good question. And that's part of what I'd like for us to just take a moment, because as we're going into this whole entire conversation answers that question in my mind and in my heart. And maybe if you and I could just lay the foundation of that, like, where did you first start thinking about that overlap? Was it obvious to you from the get-go? Is it something that you were introduced to? Tell us a little bit about that, and then let's trade back and forth kind of how we came to see that connection, and maybe we can help listeners to do the same.
Sure. Yeah. So no is the answer to your question. I had never really thought in cult dynamic frameworks until I started engaging with a very dear friend of mine. We've known each other, I think, for more than 15 years, but lots of time and space and geography between meeting and now reconnecting. We both found ourselves moving to the same city at the same time without any planning. And so we've become very close. And they are doing some graduate work in post-cult trauma recovery. And we were just talking because she's so supportive and she was helping me prepare for this conversation. And we were just talking about the cross-pollination of ideas. My work, which I've been doing for a long, long time, I don't separate my scholarship with my activism, with my art, with my spirituality. It's really the same thing for me. So I talk about it a lot, if you let me. And so my ideas were kind of pollinating how they were conceptualizing of their work, which is now totally unfurling and flourishing. And then being exposed to her scholarship really kind of gave me this kind of insight, like, oh, wow, cult recovery is a key audience to what I'm speaking about. I didn't even realize this is what I was talking about, because I do talk a lot about cultural appropriation and spiritual appropriation and like the hunger that drives us. And I'm speaking from my positionality, which is as a white woman in the wellness space, you know, in or out or post or whatever. And the ways in which genuine, valid, beautiful, and important longings can lead us down some tricky terrain, because the terrain is sick. You know, we live within systems that are sick, and we aren't always aware of it. So yeah, what Bell Hooks calls the imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. I might be mixing up those words. And those are like, whoa words for a lot of us. It's like, what do you mean? And my journey has been largely like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And why should I care? So I take a really trauma-informed approach. And this is a silly metaphor, I sometimes think, but if I'm serious about how I see trauma as germinating this whole system that we're a part of, and woven all throughout our personal and familial narratives, let alone our societal, racial, dynamics. Trauma is so much a part of how we are operating and the water we're swimming in a lot of ways, that if I want to be strategic and effective in the work I've been tasked to do, speaking to folks like myself, then I want to take an approach that honors and uplifts folks rather than tears them down. So it's like a spoonful of sugar. I don't know that I'm explaining it correctly, but like my life, growing up with some hard stuff, I'll say that, shame and ridicule and blame and resentment really didn't help me do better or be better. So it's kind of straddling two worlds doing this work. Like, we want to hold ourselves accountable. We want to look at the damage and the harm. We want to own our shit, and we want to love and be tender with ourselves, our inner children are wounded ancestral scars, and how do we do that? How do we talk about it,
Yeah.
in a way that is sensitive to the ongoing colonial dynamics and trauma that, like, it's one thing. This is something I want to say too. Like, I don't want to co-opt any narratives of trauma from, like, let's say Indigenous folks or Black folks. That is not the same thing,
Right.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
And yet, but also,
Mhm.
what I'm learning about relational dynamics, recovery, healing, family systems, we can't expect to show up to our relationships and help heal them if we aren't doing our own work, if we aren't owning the ways in which we are broken and terrified and lacking something essential that we need.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where I come into this conversation with your audience.
So just this morning, I was reading an article, just a really beautifully written article that was about the distinction between accountability and punishment. And this is going to circle us back to the original question I asked you around cult dynamics, because this distinction between understanding the difference between accountability and punishment, I'm realizing is so key to us being able to do anything about all of this. It's a beautiful article. I'll link to it. One of the things she really emphasizes is, punishment is about retribution and accountability is about stopping harm. Like, at its core, that's what it's about. And that's really what I hear you describing. Is we hear this word accountability, it's like a buzzword lately, and that's a good thing. And at the same time, though, I think a lot of us being, again, from the position of being a white woman in wellness, who's also been conditioned by a tone policed, anger-phobic way of relating to the world, we think of accountability as retribution, as this, victim, villain, perpetrator, cycle, when in fact, that's not what accountability is. That model of punishment actually is, and this is where I get all fired up, but like what you described in terms of I call it capital C cult dynamics. Like when I speak about cult dynamics, there's cult dynamics and then there's capital C cult dynamics. And to me, the capital C cults are what you described: white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. There's more. There's quite a few. Those capital C cults created the model of so-called accountability that we know as punishment. And we sort of think that that's what it looks like. And there's so many other ways that, Indigenous populations have been practicing since well before we colonized the land that we now live on, where there's a process of accountability that looks nothing like that. And that the way that we do accountability, culturally speaking, in our colonized cultures that we occupy, is this punishment model that's based on the way that we inherited the colonizing mindset. And this is where I feel so drawn to the work you do, and I feel it's so important, and I just can't emphasize enough how connected it is to the purpose of this series. That decolonization of ourselves that you and I are going to talk about, this process that you've been in, that I'm just barely beginning to embark on, is part of how we create a social structure where we're waking up from capital C cult dynamics as well as the small c cult dynamics. Like, it's happening simultaneously. And like, we can't actually heal the small c cult dynamics unless we address where we learned how to behave this way in the first place.
And what was stolen from us on a cultural, spiritual level that left us with such a ravenous longing.
Yes.
And that's the trauma-informed piece that is so important, I think, to really catalyze this work for white folks. And I want to just, like, my work is always like, it's really nuanced. It's hard for me to sometimes proclaim some of the good sounding, feel-gooding things without really laying the groundwork, because as the elders I learned from say, like, we're not there yet. We're not all there yet. And so there's so much learning and unlearning that has to happen. But it's not linear. It's not like it has to all happen before we, like, give ourselves permission to honor what we ourselves have lost. the fragmentation we are experiencing within these systems of domination and oppression, you know? I think that getting in touch with that helps build our compassion and our empathy and our accountability. I talk about relational accountability in the trilogy of our relationships to self, others, and land. And I love what you just illuminated there, like versus punishment, because I think in some of the ways in which we as white folks perceive the conversation around critical whiteness, white supremacy, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, is that we are being told we're the root of all evil and we suck inherently. It's all our fault. We're like no spice losers. You know, I'm being facetious, but that is, I think, what folks hear. It's about learning to listen differently and becoming willing to tell ourselves maybe a new story. And I think in order to do that, and this is what I've learned, this was the germination of my journey, was hearing grandfather William Kamandaba say, remember your original instruction. Remember your original instruction. And Elder Doug Ba from Curve Lake, who I was so many of us were blessed to know and learn from, wrote in his book, This Is Our Territory, he wrote about the Ojibwe Anishinaabeg teachings, ancient teachings about there will come a time when the world hangs by a spider's thread, when life on this planet is close to collapse, unless the original instructions are remembered. And so my thesis journey back in 2016 was like, what would happen if white settlers, such as myself, began to remember our original instructions? Do we have any? Where would they be located? Wow. And what would be the potential implications of that hard heart work, which is what Georgie calls it? I guess I'd say to decolonize is to heal. And so what does this word decolonize mean? Well, first and foremost, like literally, it means to dismantle the systems of colonialism. And that means for us folks who have unearned power and privilege here, or like power relative to racialized folks, as an example, because that's just how the system works. What would be important? What's the missing ingredient that will allow us to become ready to even consider that, right? Because that sounds scary. The paradigm of thought, the consciousness that created these systems, like Western ways of knowing, and these aren't bad. These are not bad. They're just one way, but they tend to be binary. We think in binaries, like if I'm supposed to land back, if I'm supposed to give land back, I'm on stolen land. Does that mean I'm homeless? I don't get to be here? And the answer is like, well, no. It's like how feminism isn't anti-man. It's just like, you know, it's actually a different paradigm where more things can be true and more beings can be fed and safe. I think we're all suffering from collective colonial wounds. And I've heard Marie Batiste, for example, who's a Mi'kmaq scholar, say we all must become healers in this wounded space. So some of the questions I'm a little bit obsessed with is like, how do I, as a white woman, become a healer in that wounded space? Be in service to the healing of these crises of disconnection without falling into the same traps we are here to talk about, basically, without being a little bit culty or spiritually appropriating or, you know, being just a super eye roll stereotype. What does that look like? And the answers I have found lie within doing exactly what those elders have been telling me to do this whole time, is remember your original instructions. Who were you before you came here? What have you lost?
How are you remembering? What does that look like for you?
Great question. Oh my gosh. No straight answer, really. But I mean, I think blessed to have the certain amount of clarity I have, like both sides of my family, my mom and my dad, big Irish clan families, big Irish Catholic. My maternal grandfather came over. I think he was still in the womb. So he came over from some Dublin slums, I'm told, where that line had been chimney sweeps, for example, for a number of generations. And my dad's line came during the genocide, otherwise known as the Great Hunger or the Potato Famine. So just remembering that, just like learning when did we actually come here? And that's not necessarily possible for everyone. There's some folks who've been here for multiple generations who come from many different lines, so I'm not saying this is a straightforward process. And I think that's actually kind of the point in a lot of ways. When you start to try to remember your original instructions and whatever that means in a lot of ways, it kind of puts you really in touch in a real way, in a felt sense way, of what a mess we're kind of in. It illuminates some of the like chasms and loss I've found personally.
Yeah, I think it really points to the point you made earlier that we talked about in our first conversation around that gaping hole, that desire, that the yearning that we have that leads us to appropriate and mean to borrow and then steal things
Mm-hmm.
that we have a yearning. I mean, I know for me, I'll speak for myself. I grew up in a home where my mother was Protestant, but she wasn't an open Protestant in our home because my stepdad was atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was mostly influenced by the atheism. And then by the time I was in my 20s and I was searching and searching, and when I found New Age wellness communities that were willing to give me simplified answers to questions, I was so ravenous for that
Mm-hmm.
clarity
Mm-hmm.
and the practices and the experience of depth in some cases. In other cases, just glorified dissociation. It was a mixed bag for sure. But that yearning that you speak of, it's like when we don't know and have access to that information and where to get those instructions, there is a deep yearning and a hunger. And I'm just right now, even as we're talking, just connecting dots. Like when I separated from wellness circles because of cult dynamics and just the discomfort I had around it, I was searching yet again. And I actually traveled to the country from which my great grandparents immigrated and walked the streets of this little island Vis off of Croatia that was Yugoslavia at the time. And I was so needing to be there, and being there, it was like a full body experience of coming home to something. And my dad and I jokingly refer to it as the grandmother land. It was my grandmother land pilgrimage. And I went to the registrar's office and looked through books to find more about my family. And I didn't really understand what that yearning was about. I lost my grandmother before I was born. She took her own life. So I thought it was about that trauma imprint. But talking with you, I feel like, oh, this goes much deeper. The healing that I was reaching for and the understanding. And there were a lot of questions that went unanswered, but just the little bit of information I had that I did get, and the experience of being on the land
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of ancestors that I never met, was deeply spiritually grounding for me in a way
Mm-hmm.
that I think it's part of what I was chasing. So I'm just fascinated having this realization, just sitting here talking with you and being like, oh, like is this what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly
Yes.
what I'm talking about. And I had a very similar experience. I've been dreaming of going to Ireland my whole life, and I just turned 40 this year. And although I'm still paying it off, I just took myself there finally. And when I came to Connemara in County Galway on the west coast, which is where my father's family is from, it was full body sobbing. Like it was just, I felt like, I don't know, it broke my heart. It was like meeting a god, and I couldn't handle it. It was so brilliantly beautiful. It was heartbreaking, and yet also I really did feel the grief of the people who had to leave that place because of colonial imposed starvation and all kinds of things. Like the grief of having to leave that place, of having been grown up out of a place, of having a language, a culture, to be held in the arms of that place, the Cailleach, which is like the old wise woman in Ireland in a very kind of creatrix way, similar to Gluskapi of the Mi'kmaq people or Nanabojo of the Anishinaabeg people. It's devastating. And, we forgot, at least my family, but I think it's really a very common story. And certainly thinkers and writers taught me this. We're shipped here a lot of times, like the Irish in that time. It wasn't always a choice. Some did have that choice and fled. And we got to become white. When we first got here, we were definitely low rung and not well treated, similar to Black folks, not at all the same. We didn't experience slavery the way Black folks did here at all. But it was a pretty shitty time for the Irish refugees. But then we got to become white. We got to buy into whiteness. And whiteness really doesn't have the most to do with the color of our skin or the pigment. It's a system of power over.
Which
And
is what makes it so culty, because it's
yeah,
not a real thing.
it's also why reverse racism doesn't exist, which I think some
That's
people
right.
struggle with. Like,
That's right.
yeah, people can be rude or mean or say stuff that hurts our feelings about whiteness, but it's not racism, because racism is a system of oppression or power over. And people from all over, like your ancestors are from an island off Croatia, mine are from an island off of the UK, and like there's Italians and all kinds of folks that have a complexion that gave them an immediate ticket to the front of the line here. That's all it means. And it doesn't also mean that we don't struggle and we don't experience poverty and abuse and horrible things. The point is, this system harms us all.
Yes.
To certainly different degrees.
Yeah.
But that's why we need a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that ability to assimilate, which is true of my ancestors. Interestingly enough, on one side there's one lineage on my dad's side that's from this little island that was Yugoslavia, that they did have to flee the island. It was occupied by the military during a war, and a lot of people from that island fled to San Pedro, California, and they came and were able to assimilate into the system of whiteness. And I think that this piece around whiteness, I just want to hone in on for a second, because I realized for me, I was speaking with a white person who was having the common sort of flooding of the body when hearing the words white supremacy. And I was saying to them that was an experience that I had for a very long time, until I began to learn about anti-racism and the systemic nature of what you're talking about, that it's a system, that now I can hear whiteness and white supremacy and understand. I don't have a visceral reaction to it because I don't identify with it in the same way. I'm able to see it as a system that I am a part of, that I benefit from, that is not me. And that key distinction, if I go all the way back to the ancestral line, they needed to identify with it in order to assimilate. The sacrifice is inherent in that, which goes all the way back to what you said before. You said something to the effect of language is the carrier of culture, that one of your mentors had said that to you. That assimilation process was about stripping away the Slavic language that they spoke. And I don't know a word of the language of my ancestors by design, right? I was assimilated into the cult of whiteness. And how do we, when we're a part of it and in it, deconstruct it? I don't have a freaking clue. That's why we're here. But I guess I feel like I'm going in a million different directions. But
no, I love it. I'm with you.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted
It's hard to speak linearly.
No, because it's not.
About all this stuff. And what I do, I love that we're on video. This is the it's actually pre-Celtic Triskele, or triple spiral. I love it so much, and it became such a huge part of all of my work.
You can find it on Aleyah's website if you're curious to see The tattoo that she's
The
showing me.
Triskele. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's a
It's
horse.
an ancient pre-Celtic symbol. For folks here, the easiest analogy I say is like it's the Celtic version of the Indigenous medicine wheel, which is a teaching tool. It's a simple graphic that different cultures can layer a lot of teachings into. And this Triskele, this triple spiral for me, it's like it's all connected.
Yes.
It's all connected, you
That's
know,
right.
in terms of like the crisis of disconnection personally, you know, intergenerational trauma, isolation, mental health conditions, you know, that are so rampant socially, societally, racially, and with the earth. Like,
Mhm.
I don't want to be a bummer, but we are on the verge of collapse and
That's right.
extinction, and
Mhm.
capitalism is literally killing us.
Mm.
But I just want to back up and just, if it's not yet clear, I loved how you said it's so, it really crystallizes it for me. Like when we assimilated into the cult of whiteness,
Mhm.
that does not mean that we are bad.
Not at all.
It could mean that we are part of some bad things
Mhm.
and that we are in some bad habits of mind and relating. But ultimately, it's because we don't yet know better, you know? And if we're willing to listen and learn, it can be uncomfortable, it can be messy. It definitely, for me, involves profound grief work, but it's really nutritive. It's really nourishing. It's really grounding and orienting. And it has gifted me infinitely more than it's taken away, you know?
So what I'm curious about, because you're saying it's all connected, and I feel that even as we talk, it's like going in all these different directions that are all like speaking to this one core. So when I look at your path as a white woman, decolonizing, taking back authority, and I mean that in the sense of authorship of your own life, like what's the real story of your lineage and your culture, and you're reconnecting to that. And simultaneously, though, you are spending a lot of time in spaces with other cultures and learning from them. How are those two things connected? Because I know they are, in terms of this process, because I think we do in our culture think in binary, like you said. So, Aleyah, are you saying I need to go over here and be focused on learning about my ancestry, and that's what I need to do? Or are you saying I need to engage with people, who I can learn from, like BIPOC folks who have an understanding of anti-racism, and which one should I do? And I feel like your answer is going to be both and. So I guess the reason I'm asking this question is because I see this in wellness spaces a lot. It's like, go do your inner work. And it's like, I know you describe it as living activism. And so I want you to speak to that, I guess, is the real question I'm asking. What is living activism? How are you shaping that in the way that you're doing this work?
Where I'll start is with the words of Dr. Elder Shirley Williams. I call her Auntie. Many of us call her the boss. She's an amazing elder language speaker, teacher, and she was one of the Anishinaabeg who supported this work and is supporting this book. And she says, they made you forget. That's what they mean by you have to start with yourself. And so that's part of it. But like this Triskele reveals to me, my methodology, my way of doing this work is threefold. It's deep listening, critical self-reflection, and embodied action in community.
Say those three again so we can
Sure,
take them in.
sure. Deep listening,
Mhm.
critical self-reflection, and embodied action. And together, those three things, which, you can map onto this triple spiral, is my embodied decolonial praxis. Praxis is a fancy word that I learned from the pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire. My understanding is it's like learning and then putting into practice what you learn and then learning from that and then coming back, and it's a constant dance between learning and acting and reflecting. That's essentially what it is. And so it's not linear. It's a swirl. It's a messy, uncertain, show up, try your best, and keep going type of thing. Yeah, so like you don't want to just navel gaze and I think that's kind of the trap a lot of us fall in with the wellness stuff and a little bit culty healing spaces, is it's all about the self and it's not accountable to the other relationships that are inherent to being human in place. And so another mistake we often make is like getting the message, you're responsible for, being a part of the change. So you show up and you're like, I have so many good ideas and I want to help. And there wasn't enough listening and critical self-reflection first. And so, yeah, each of those headings on that spiral path has a real lot of subsets of learning, which I hopefully will be able to capture coherently in the book version of the 300-page thesis. But yeah, does that answer some of that question?
It really does. It really does. I think I love that it not only answers the question, but it gives us some touchstones. Yeah, that was beautifully put.
Next week, Aleyah and I continue our conversation on decolonization, engaging in a deep dive deconstruction of cultural appropriation, and why it is so damn important to attend to nuance when offering relational accountability. Here's a quick preview.
I am not saying, and nor is anyone saying, that white people should have no spiritual practice and no spiritual tools and no spiritual community. In fact, a lot of Indigenous and Black and people of color elders, knowledge holders, authors, speakers who I've interacted with are like, it's vital that we have and remember and use spiritual tools because we are spiritually sick. Personally, culturally, socially, ecologically, we are dying. And so no wonder there's such a hunger and a search for what feeds us. We're going out and seeking. And what I think is even more important is that if you fancy yourself a good person who, has maybe heard about this stuff called racism and colonialism and white supremacy, and you're like, well, that all sounds terrible and I don't want to be a part of that. So what should I do? Maybe it's worth just taking a step back and going like, maybe there's something to this.
Thank you again for listening, and check out the show notes for links to individuals and resources that were referenced in this episode. And if you'd like to reach out to me personally, you can find me at thedeeperpulse.com/share. I'll see you back here next week.